Hi, everyone. Welcome to Journey number 40. And today I have Vivian Nunez on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you here, Vivian. I think you're doing some really amazing work down in New York there. And, touching on a lot of topics that maybe some people are afraid to go into or aren't talked about as much. So, really happy to be here. And if you could just do a quick introduction of yourself, of, who Vivian is.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me, Jared. So my name is Vivian. I go by Viv or Vivian. I am at Viv Nunez on Instagram and kind of all the internet places you can find me. And I am a writer and a content creator. I started a website back in 2014, so a couple of years ago now, that was focused primarily on young adults who are grieving. And that really is what spun me out into how impactful the digital world could be and bringing community around, like you mentioned, topics that are sometimes taboo, right? Things like mental health, like grief, anything that makes us feel incredibly vulnerable, honestly, wasn't on trend as much as it is right now. To talk about self-care and therapy the way, it was 8 years ago was much more, it felt novel when I was doing it and when other people were doing it, which is important because of the different ways that those identities can intersect, right? So I'm Latina, I'm a woman. I was 21 at the time when I first started talking about it. And so it felt great to be able to connect with other people in that space. So I've built my career really around creating content in the digital formats across all social platforms, and then also writing about these topics in longer form pieces.
Amazing. And, I'm curious for you
Mhm.
on when you were starting your platform. Have you always been the kind of person that takes charge and, like you want to go out and make it your own? Or was it more of you looked for places to, either support yourself or looking for people that have gone through similar things and you couldn't find them? And so it was almost out of necessity that you started your own. Can you talk to me a little bit through those beginning
Yeah.
phases?
So it was really a mix of both. I lost my mom when I was 10 years old, and then I lost my grandmother when I was 21. And right when she was passing away, I was her primary caretaker. So I was suddenly in this caregiver role, making really big end of life decisions for someone before I'd even graduated from college. And I felt all this pressure kind of piling up. And it was a very clear juxtaposition as well between what it meant to grieve as a 21-year-old versus as a 10-year-old. Right. At 10, granted, no one really knew what to do with me then anyway, but there was an allowance of like, she is grieving versus at 21. It felt like my professors, everyone around me was like, oh, it's just your grandmother, kind of move on. But in the context for my life, my grandma was my second mom, right? I had lived with her. She was my legal guardian. So there were a lot of nuances there that I felt were erased in my description of what grief was supposed to be for me at 21. And so it was that kind of led me to understand that I wanted to create a space where I could feel seen and feel connected to other people, particularly because I am or was very, very introverted. Right. Even now, I'm still a little bit of that, but I was really shy growing up. I felt very othered by the fact that I didn't have a mom. And so it was never in my bandwidth to participate in any of the things that already existed within the grief space, which was like camps for teenagers or things where that were more in person, where just that didn't make sense for who I was. A virtual community made so much sense because I was able to participate without ever having to raise my hand that I was actively participating. And I wanted to create that same kind of experience for another person who was maybe on the shyer side or maybe just carrying their pain in a different way. So the internet really allowed for that. And then as I kept posting or kept growing, it made me more comfortable owning these truths and owning these stories in ways that made sense for me.
No, thanks for sharing that. And I think grief just in general is a very, tough subject for a lot of people in the sense that it makes them
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable. And so I feel like a lot of people just shove it under the rug or dismiss it, or there's a lot of preconceived, maybe even rules around it, almost, I imagine if that's maybe some of the things that, your professors or people that you were grieving with, when your grandmother passed, of, well, it's just your grandma, so
Mm-hmm.
it should look like this, or
Yeah,
yeah.
I think there's a lot of that there, and there's a lot of beliefs around what a traditional family structure looks like. And
Mhm.
I never fit that. So it was always, having to explain kind of what my relationship was to the people I had lost, but then also just like who I was as a person.
Yeah.
And grief in and of itself brings up a lot to your point. I think mostly because mortality is something that we're very afraid to talk about as individuals for ourselves, especially for others. And so it becomes this more nuanced conversation around like, wait, what does it actually mean to grieve? And how does that look like if I've, it's been 19 years since my mom passed away. And through that, I learned that there are no stages in grief, nothing that happens in a checklist manner. It is very cycle. It's a cycle that is repetitive in nature and that jumps between different steps at different times. And I've seen that happen over and over again over the last few almost decades.
Yeah. And, it was actually a topic that I dove into about a year ago because
Mhm.
I started to have a little bit of curiosity around it, mainly for the fact that I haven't really experienced a lot of,
Mm.
grief in my life of, my one grandfather passed before I was born, the next one when I was in grade 2. And then, the most recent one was my grandmother, who passed away, but she wasn't in the best of health for years. And so, it was almost very slow and almost accepted. And not as sudden. And
Mhm.
so talking with different people about it, of when I'm trying to talk to people who are grieving, when I'm trying to support people that are grieving, I feel like a lot of times we don't know what to do. And um one of the things that one of my good friends told me is that grieving for him is different with every death. With every
Mhm.
person that passes, it's completely different. And so there's not one rule of, oh, this person is grieving, so you
A
should do.
100%.
Yeah, I'm just curious if what your experiences are with that and with the two different losses, and how, I mean, obviously there was the age difference, but yeah, if
Mhm.
you could just speak to that more of what you've seen.
100%. I mean, I think that loss is a unique individualized experience, right? Like I have an older brother. He's 11 years older than I am. And so I was 10 when my mom died and he was 21. And we lost two completely different mothers, right? We lost the same human being, but we lost different relationships, different experiences, our life, where we were in our lives, right? Like I was in elementary school, he was in college. And so those are relationship wise completely different experiences. And I think that that's something that made it really easy for me to realize how unique my experience was as a result, because just in our relationship and him and I, we had lost someone completely different. So I can't imagine what it's like if you are losing different people at different stages in your own life.
Mhm.
And for me, when I lost my grandmother, that was a very different experience, right? Because we look at it, sometimes I think we look at death and grief in a very flat way. Someone dies, you grieve. And that feels so rid of the context of that situation and the trauma that can come with it, right? Like I didn't make end of life decisions for my mom because I was 10 when that was happening, right? I was existing very on the sidelines of it all. But with my grandmother, I was talking to ICU doctors. I was in and out of the hospital. I was rehearing ambulance noises, for months afterwards. And so that adds a different layer to what you're processing in that grief. But it is really true, like what your friend said, you end up losing different people at different times. And then that ends up becoming its own version of grief, right? And I think that can feel incredibly upsetting to someone who has already grieved someone,
Mhm.
because you expect that if you did it before, that then doing it the next time will be easier or different. And while it is something that maybe doesn't feel as daunting, it isn't familiar because everyone's grief experience is so unique.
Yeah, and it's really interesting and eye-opening of, what you said there, that you and your brother, you lost the same
Mhm.
human being, but you lost a different person. And, just hearing you say that, brings to mind even how d- people that are in the same or similar points in their lives will lose the same person and grieve completely different.
100%.
And I'm curious if you've seen almost some of those emotions coming out towards other people, right? Of whether it was you and your brother, if you were breathing, or sorry, you're
Mhm.
grieving differently, and so there was almost anger, or who knows what kind of emotions came up, jealousy, between different people grieving the same person, of that's not how you should be grieving them, or yeah, whatever it might be. If you could expand on that, if anything comes to mind.
Yeah, so it wasn't anything personal with me. I think I've both because of my age and how long I have had to sit with grief, it was always something where I looked more towards people who had moms, for instance, and saw more jealousy there versus like with my brother or something,
Okay.
right? Because it felt more like I went to an all girls high school in the city, and that seemed like a really great decision at the beginning. And then you go into like you're 16 and everyone is going to the mother daughter dance with someone, and like I'm not, right? And so there was a lot more added weight and pressure, I think, because of the context of the school I went to. Um, so things like that ended up really exasperating my grief for me. But I think that it's something that I've read a lot about and I've heard other people share that when you're coming at grief in this very flat way, you can sometimes impose, well, this is how it's supposed to happen, or you're not grieving the right way, or the way you are grieving is making me angry because it is not the way I am grieving.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of comparison game. There's something called grief comparison. And it's this idea that we are looking at other people's grief and saying, yours is less than mine because mine feels like this. And therefore mine is the right one. And that is a very hard thing to both undo and allow for a different definition to happen, because like we don't get a guidebook when this happens, right? You don't get a book and say like, here's what exactly what your grief is going to look like for the next whatever amount of years. Not even for the first year. Everyone's is so unique. And so I think that the best thing that when those emotions is that this acceptance that grief isn't flat, right? And it's not just sadness, it's anger, it's disappointment, it's jealousy, it's sometimes happiness. And so having it be these range of emotions, I think takes the pressure off it having to be this one thing.
Yeah, just even that general idea of accepting it's going to be different. It's going to be different for different people. It's going to be different each time you experience it. And, I'm curious for you if someone were to ask you like how to best support someone who is grieving, how would you answer that question for them, both with yourself and what you've seen from other people?
Yeah. The best thing that you can possibly do is be there, um, in a way that does not feel like a responsibility to the other person, right? It is dropping off food at their door, not asking them necessarily what they want to eat. I think one of the better questions to ask if you don't know the person's like dietary preferences is what are you not allowed to eat, or like what can't you eat? What are you allergic to? Because then that helps you stay on the safe side of like what they can eat. But dropping it off at the door and not making a big deal of that, right? Texting someone and saying, hey, I hope I'm just thinking about you, but knowing and like adding in a sentence that says, no pressure on texting back. I just wanted to let you know that you're like in my thoughts or my prayers, whatever. I think having that one-way conversation with them for a while is actually what allows them, especially at the beginning, to then feel like they can come back to that conversation or that relationship without feeling like they have to apologize for having been absent or having been in a different kind of context than they usually are. Um, but that would be my biggest piece of advice, is just find a way to be present without being imposing, and with like giving someone the opportunity to then jump back in whenever they can and in whatever way they can. I think another thing that I I both experience and hear a lot is that when you grieve and you lose someone, you tend to have a different rotation of friends at the end of that, like once you start feeling more like yourself than you did at the beginning. And I think a lot of that comes down to what we're talking about, which is like it is hard for grief to kind of pick a table, like pick a seat at the table, because then it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. But I think it's also just hard because people don't name it. And so it becomes such a taboo thing in the conversation that then it's just so much harder to return to that relationship. And so the best thing you can possibly do is just make it as least awkward as possible for the next person.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you say that too, of what can seem like such little things of, well, what do you
Mhm.
want to eat? Or just even looking for a response, what with somebody that's going through a lot, whether they be in crisis, whether they be grieving,
Mhm.
whatever it might be, if they're depressed, sometimes those tiny little actions can feel like the world to actually perform.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah.
Yeah. Like on a regular Thursday last week, I mean, it was hard for me to decide what I wanted for dinner. So I can't imagine in the context of just like feeling like the weight is on my shoulders and feeling just so utterly paused in my life by like the things happening around me, that someone asking like, what do you want for dinner, is as big as someone asking, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? Like both things are just too far away for me to think about. Like
Yeah.
it just needs to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think one of the other big points in there was even the idea of people looking for affirmation, right? Even,
Mhm.
again, that little line of you saying, don't feel pressured to respond, or, even if it's outward like that, telling them, but especially that inward pressure that I think a lot of us put on ourselves of, well, I need to help this person. So I need to know that
Mhm.
I'm doing a good job. And even though maybe the intention isn't there, a lot of times it actually turns selfish
Mhm.
of, I want the affirmation that I'm doing a good job, that I'm supporting this person, that I'm, there for them, or whatever it might be, when just the action themselves are really what that person wants.
Yeah, and I think it's natural, right? I think we are all in a world where we like two-way relationships and conversations to be equal. I say something and you say thank you, right? And I say you're welcome, and then we go back and forth. And I think it's when human emotions are involved and it becomes that moment of like, this person may not have the capacity for that, but does that not mean that they're deserving of it?
Mhm.
That's not true. Like they are deserving of that kind of support. And this is exactly what friendship is, right? Or any relationship. It's like, I will be here during the good and bad times. And sometimes the bad times means you can't reaffirm that I'm awesome.
Yeah.
And like that's fine.
Yeah.
Right. But I think it does take a level of, let me sidestep my ego a little bit to be okay with the fact that I may not get the pat on the head for doing this from someone else, but I can still do that for myself. And I can, taking that pressure off, it does so much for the other person, right? Like it makes it, I think the bigger thing that I mentioned too earlier is just like, it's not just the immediacy of, oh, I don't have to respond right now. It's that when in 2 weeks I finally have the bandwidth to respond, I don't feel shame
Yeah.
for coming back into that relationship because suddenly you've made it okay for me to do that without me having to first apologize.
Yeah. And that's a huge one that I don't think that I know I've never thought about before
Mm-hmm.
too, is almost the added pressure or the added shame of, oh, I was in a bad place, so I couldn't,
Mm-hmm.
show up for you, even though they're trying to support, the person grieving. They feel like maybe they've let their friend down. Oh, I didn't respond to you. I didn't get back to you. Like I've been a bad person because I took
Mm-hmm.
this time for myself. And yeah, that's really interesting of almost having that added pressure, which almost either isolates or can make things even worse.
Yeah, it can lead to spirals, right? I mean, how many times have we all felt like in a really bad place and we're just like, I can't text back today. And then suddenly it's 2 weeks later and it's awkward and you feel embarrassed because you never texted back to that one small question 2 weeks ago. But
Yeah.
the thing is that I think subjectiveness is something that is subjectivity is like something that is so core to really big feelings, whether it's grief or anything, rather mental health issues, whatever it may look like. It's like right now it may seem so small to you, a person who is dealing with something and like floating through life and you're fine. When someone asks you, hey, how are you, or how was your day, or oh, what'd you do yesterday, it may seem so small and you're like, of course I'm going to answer this right now, like I have total bandwidth for that.
Yeah.
But for someone who's like really struggling, who maybe just got through a whole day of work and like that was like, they just feel so relieved they were able to do that. Having to then engage in an extra conversation that night is just way beyond emotional bandwidth.
Yeah.
And I think that we don't talk about that enough. Like people's emotional bandwidth shifts, especially when we're talking right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic still, right? Like we're years into having to live in the way we've been having to live. And so that's hard on people. And I think that the more that we can cut people slack, the better.
For sure. And, like another one of my friends, he's struggled with depression a lot. And
Mhm.
one of the things he tells me all the time is, for him, success in a day is just getting out of bed. Right. And it
Mhm.
can be, as simple as that. And when you put that into context and put that into, looking at the bigger picture of, it might be something as little as that takes up your entire bandwidth for that day. And so just being respectful of that. And for me, I think a big piece of it too is fostering relationships where that other person knows that they don't have to put on a face when they're asked with that simple question, right? Of,
Mhm.
even if how are you doing or how is your day, making it a real question of, instead of I'm just expecting you to say something positive, and if you don't say anything other than good, it's going to throw me off, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going to become a big deal. Allowing for that safety, allowing for those real conversations of, what, actually it's a bad day or a bad time, and not even necessarily needing to go into it, but having those friendships where it's like, that's okay to say that. That's okay to have a bad day, or just to say, I don't have the
Mm-hmm.
bandwidth for anything really right now.
Literally. And like that kind of relationship is built on those same actions of like, hey, you don't have to text back, and hey, I'm just checking in on you. And that's how we make it more known that our lives are just what they are, and we're just kind of floating by, and like every single day shifts, right? Like some days, yes, getting out of bed is my like high moment. Like I did it. Like that is the thing I'm checking off my list. Everything else after that is just like an added bonus. But then there are other days where my level of like achievement is a little bit different than that, right? And maybe further into the day than just the morning time. But I think that the more we can accept it, the easier it gets. I was thinking about this Taylor Swift song that is called This Is Me Trying. And how we don't think about, like, for a lot of people who are coping with really chronic illnesses, mental health issues, any kind of addiction recovery, like them getting through a day without falling back into that, or without making decisions based on that, or with just like surviving whatever it is they're going through, like that is them trying. And even if it to us it may look like, wait, you barely did anything today, it's really about having enough to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and realize like their path may look different, but it's a really hard one to walk as well.
For sure. And, going back to something else that you said of,
Mhm.
this expected almost response of, it's a two-way relationship. Um, I give, you thank me, right?
Mhm.
And back and forth all the time. One thing that really helped me with that was the idea, like changing the idea of balance in my brain. Of
Mhm.
balance doesn't necessarily mean something in the middle all the time, right? You can have a balanced relationship. You can have a two-way relationship, but you need to look at it over the course of a year, over the course
Mhm.
of the entire relationship, not day to day. It doesn't mean that every single day I have to give just as much as I take to you. It means that sometimes one person in that relationship is going to need more, sometimes they're going to need less, and
Mhm.
it's that willingness to go in between them. And sometimes it's going to be extended period of time. Sometimes you're going to be going through a very tough,
Yeah.
day, week, month, year, and you're going to need more from that person, and that's okay. That doesn't mean it's not a two-way relationship.
Yep. I 100% agree. I think it's something that when like a really prime example of that in my life is I have a boyfriend who's very amazing, but we go through seasons where one of us cooks more than the other, right? And it seems like so small, right? Because you're like, what does it have to do with anything? But sometimes that's exactly a perfect example of just like overall who we have bandwidth in, or like where bandwidth is sitting, right? Like right now I'm in the season where I'm doing a lot of the cooking because I'm enjoying it more and it's exciting for me, and I'm like, this is helping me cope with so many other things. But there are seasons where like I barely pick up a pan and he's the one that's like doing it for months on end. But that's where I see it the most, where I'm like, oh, like that is how we balance each other out. Because it's not like I cook 2 meals and 1 week he cooks another 2 meals, which is fine if that's how your um relationship works out as well. But for us, really is like I'll do like a 4 or 5 month stint, and he'll do the next 4 or 5 months, very unintentionally. We're not planning it out.
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to what we were talking about in general, which is like giving permission for those things to flow,
Yeah.
right? For it to be exactly what it needs to be. And then just being cognizant of like anytime that I do feel too overwhelmed, not just with cooking, with anything in life, having that open conversation with him, being like, well, I need a little bit more taken off my plate. But then it becomes a lot more of an open conversation to do that. And it's applicable across the board. Like, I know we've been talking about grief, but it's the same with mental health. It's the same with any relationship at any point. You just want to make sure that you're feeling seen in that relationship, and what that looks like can change any other time.
For sure. And I love, you said flow, and the word that was
Mhm.
coming to me was flexibility, which I think is the
Yeah.
same thing. And it's, again, that willingness to step into the flexibility, that it doesn't, just because we've decided it this 1 month, or it worked for this period of time, doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And
Mhm.
for me, I'm huge on looking at intentions and not the specifics. Like, what is the
Mhm.
intention behind this? It's not, oh well, I cooked twice, so you should or you should cook once. That's a detail. It's, I have
Mhm.
a little more bandwidth. I'm okay with cooking more. If that's 2 times, if that's for every meal for a week straight, whatever that is, it's just putting it into perspective.
100%.
Yeah. And, switching gears a little bit here, I saw one of your videos and you were talking about this idea of being patted on the back for being so mature, for being,
Mhm.
I think it was when your grandmother was in the hospital and, the doctor saying, oh, you must be pre-med, and you're
Mhm.
using, and they were almost patting you on the back instead of allowing you that space to really kind of step into your emotions. Can you just expand on that story a little bit more?
Yeah, of course. So that's actually from a speech I did at EndWell, which is an end of life conference back in 2019 or 2018, I think. I feel like it's been ages at this point. But it is that conversation focused specifically on how we commend people for wearing their lived experiences in such a way that makes us less uncomfortable. Really, that was really the crux of the whole conversation. It was this idea in my life where I was taking care of my grandmother. I was a senior in college. I was her primary caretaker. I was, going through my semester. I was interning. I was doing balancing all of these realities in different parts of myself. And instead of anyone asking me, like, how are you doing this? Like, are you okay? I was commended and it was patted on the head and I was told, oh, you must be pre-med. And I was a marketing major. I was the furthest thing from pre-med. But instead of taking this time and the discomfort, knowing that like a passing comment like, oh, you must be pre-med or like you're doing so well at this takes about 2 seconds to say. And then you've kind of checked your box of acknowledging my age and like the fact that I am in the situation without ever having to get into the nitty gritty of like what this actually means for me. Asking me, wait, how are you doing this would have been a longer conversation. And I think that we do that with people, right? When they're wearing their suffering well, we are thankful because it means we don't have to dive deep into the idea of their suffering and figure out what that looks like in their lives. But that talk was really, I think, a call to action for the people around those people, but also for the people living in that reality, right? Like I, for so long, wore that as a badge of honor. Like, oh, I'm doing so great because they think I'm doing so great. And this is what it looks like. And then when my grandmother passed away, I had so much anxiety and I had so many panic attacks because suddenly, like, this person I had dedicated my life to was no longer there. And I had all of this time. And I was sitting with myself and being like, I don't know what to do because I've only ever gotten patted on the head for taking care of someone else.
Yeah.
Never got patted on the head because I was never taking care of myself.
Yeah.
And so it was this new learning curve of like, what do I do and how do I do it? And I think that my talk was really a call to action. So if you find yourself feeling kinship to me and feeling like we are one and the same, that I hope you take a minute to pause and be like, this isn't like a good feeling. Like, what can I do to switch this up in my life that's possible? And if you are someone who sees that in someone else, taking the time to ask, like, it's really simple, but just literally taking 2 seconds to ask, how are you actually doing, can maybe relieve so much stress off of someone's shoulders.
For sure. And, it's interesting because very different for me, but it still spoke so much. And, where it resonated in my life was, um, you know, I felt like I had to grow up very early in my
Mm-hmm.
household. I essentially became the de facto parent in my household, even
Mm-hmm.
though my family was together, but emotionally, I was the one that held everybody together. And there was a lot of fighting in my house, and my sister has gone through a lot and
Mm-hmm.
is doing great, and we have a great relationship, but it was very tough growing up in that household together. And what it turned into for me was this idea that I had to be quote unquote perfect,
Mm-hmm.
that I had to get good grades, had to play sports, I had to get a good job, whatever it might be. I had to check off all those boxes, and it was almost this overwhelming pressure of I can't add any more stress to my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't show that I'm having a bad day. I can't show that it's hard. I can't show any of that because I need to take care of them. And what it turned into as well is living my life for everybody else. And one of my big awakenings was I had the conversation with myself of, well, if I wasn't trying to impress the person across from me, who would I be? How would I act?
Mm-hmm.
What would I do? And I didn't have an answer. And that's one of the things that, kicked me off of my journey of figuring out
Mm-hmm.
who I actually am when I'm not just trying to live my life for other people.
And it's a hard one, right? Especially when you've spent so much time taking care of other people.
Mhm.
You, I think, end up having to ask for forgiveness from yourself for all the times you didn't take care of yourself, which is really hard. Like sitting and asking yourself for forgiveness and figuring out what that looks like is a really hard thing to do. And then adding to that, the next step is like actually doing something differently, which in a lot of cases is somewhat impossible, right? Like if I had asked myself, what am I doing? Like, how am I not taking care of myself right in the middle of my grandmother being sick? It would have been impossible for me to switch to do something else. So almost not having that awareness was my survival, because it meant that I could still get through the days and take care of her, even if I wasn't taking care of myself, because not acknowledging that I wasn't was actually going to make my job really hard, right? And my life much harder. And so I think sometimes being in that survival mode is okay, but like when you do have that opening to suddenly ask yourself a different question, it's okay if it takes a while to get to that point of like asking for forgiveness, figuring out your game plan for what's next, and acting on that game plan,
Yeah.
But I do think it's important. And, I think about my life now, almost 9 years later, and wow, like it is night and day from what it was right after my grandmother died. And I'm better at boundaries with my family. I'm better at boundaries with people in general. I'm better at self-caring and like trying my best to like myself, even on the days when it's really hard. But it doesn't come easy, right? It's still something that's very much an uphill battle. But I also see how much more worth it is because I'm more calm now than I probably have ever been.
It's so interesting that you say it's a survival,
Mhm.
almost a matter of survival, because I had that very similar realization of, and it was a big piece of my forgiveness to
Mhm.
myself was realizing that I had to do that to get through what I got through,
Yeah.
and switching it, instead of shaming myself, instead of being hard on myself for like, why did I do that? Why did I do it for so long? Whatever it might be, it was thanking it. Like, thank you for getting
Mhm.
me past that time in my life. Thank you for allowing me to get through this very, very difficult event or time or whatever it might have been. And at the same time, then accepting, and almost I talk to myself all the time, and it might sound weird, but they're like, I don't need you anymore. Thank you
Mhm.
for what you did, and I don't need you anymore. Like, I'm so thankful you gave me my superpowers, you taught me so much, and now I'm going to move on, and you'll still be there in case I need you, but I do need to move on. And you can't just live your entire life in that, which I think some people do fall into.
It's hard, right? Because I think I love what you just said. Like, I don't need you anymore. But it is something you have to say out loud, right? Like, you have to constantly say. I find myself doing the same thing, right? Which is like a lot of the survival mechanisms that I used that suited me well, 10 plus years ago, just don't make sense into my life anymore. But it doesn't mean that my knee jerk reaction isn't to go to them, right? Like, my knee jerk reaction is. And so then now I think the thing that I've been working on a lot in therapy over the last few years is like, okay, if that's my knee-jerk reaction and it seems to be really, really hard for me not to go there instinctually, why fight instinct? So instead, if it's trying to lessen the gap between how I get there so quickly and then what I do next, right? Usually it would be, I wouldn't even notice I was there. And then it would be a long time before I can like switch gears. But now the time between that is so much shorter. It's almost as instant that I notice that this is what I'm doing and that I try to bring myself back. But it does take a lot of practice. Like so much of this, it's really interesting that so much of our taking care of other people is instant and it's like knee jerk and it's nothing about it feels like we have to learn it.
Mhm.
But taking care of ourselves is actually something we have to really hone and
Yeah.
it's a muscle to strengthen all the time.
I'm just curious for you, what you think,
Mhm.
or where do you think that comes from? Do you think that that's innate? It's just a lot easier to take care of other people than ourselves, or do you think that that's almost learned or reinforced subconsciously to us, that don't be selfish, don't take care of yourself. It's noble to take care of others, but it's selfish to take care of yourself. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly what you just said. I think it's we are reinforced since we were very young to be selfless and to be selfless, but never given, even as children, never given a boundary for that, right? We're always told be selfless, but up until what point, right? There, I think something that's become very popular to talk about lately is just the giving tree, that book, and how in the book, it's always giving, always giving, always giving, always giving, never to the point of saying, well, you're actually killing me. So like maybe I shouldn't be giving anymore,
Yeah.
right? But I think it's the same concept when we're as adults or just as we're growing up. We have been conditioned to believe that being selfless is good and being selfish is bad. And we very much equate being selfish with self-care and prioritizing ourselves.
Yeah.
I think part of it, for me at least, was I grew up in a very Latino household and in an environment where the unit of the community, of the family, was always way more important than the individuals who made it up.
Mm.
Right? Like, if you were succeeding, that's great, but is the whole unit succeeding or not? And that mindset, I think, is what erases individuals within that, right? Because we're not the same, and like, we're suffering in different ways, and we're struggling in different ways, and we're joyous in different ways,
Yeah.
but we're never giving space for that. And so I think it is something where you actively have to unlearn that being and taking care of yourself isn't a bad thing, and that being selfless is great up until the point, right? Or like, that you have to make sure that you're taken care of too, in order to be selfless in a way that's actually beneficial to like everyone around you. Because I think that when you don't, then it becomes resentment, right? Then it becomes something you have to unpack in therapy years later.
For sure. And, one of the metaphors that really helped me with that was you can't pour from an empty cup, that if your cup
Mm-hmm.
is empty, you can't fill other people's up. And, the idea that, being quote unquote selfish, taking care of yourself actually allows you to help other people more. You're better equipped
100%.
to support them, to a more fuller degree. Um, yeah. And it just how important it is. And it's, removing that stigma around it being bad, that you always just have to live for other people.
Yeah, one of my friends actually has a great kind of build on that same example, which is like, instead of just saying like I have to pour from like a full glass, or like having my glass half full, it's it's up to me to fill my pitcher.
Mm,
Like, I have a pitcher, everyone else has the glass that I pour into,
gotcha.
right? And I think that was such a great visual for me, right?
Yeah.
Because then it allows for you to take care of yourself way more than you take care of the people around you, in order for you to be able to take care of everyone around you, right? Because if you think about that too, like, this idea of a pitcher, just it visually gives you this idea of more, of like
Yeah.
something way bigger. And the reality is that we pour into way more than just one glass. Like, there are so many glasses on our table. And so the more that we can make sure that we actually have bandwidth to do that, the better.
Yeah, no, I really love that. And not only that, but for me, it's the idea that you don't drink from your own pitcher, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're filling it up to fill glasses. That doesn't mean you have to take away from your own glass.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Oh, I love that. Switching it up a little bit here is, going back to, you talked about when you first started your community and how it really wasn't, call it mental health grieving
Mm-hmm.
in that whole realm. It wasn't very popular, and it's moved, more and more into the consciousness, become more popular, become a
Mm-hmm.
more important topic, something that people talk about a lot more. Where do you think that's coming from? Why do you think that it's become more prevalent in conversations, in culture, and whatever it might be, instead of, this very niche, small thing that not a lot of people talk about?
I think it has grown with the times. I think that the ability to create content on platforms like TikTok, like Instagram, has democratized a lot of that conversation, right? Usually, something like therapy, something like mental health well-being, it felt like a privilege for certain people, but not for all people, right? I think still within certain communities, like the Latino community, the BIPOC community, it is still a very taboo conversation, and something that you have to, there's a bigger level of education that needs to happen, especially for older generations, so that it becomes more normalized. But I do think that for younger generations, it is such a like second nature thing now, because social media has made it so. But I was at the beginning of that kind of social influx on Instagram. And so it's been wonderful actually to see how over 8 years it went from like me and a couple other people to it being a thing, right? Like, it being a trend, it being every Sunday you're seeing everyone's Sunday self-care routine on TikTok. And it's just so cool.
Mhm.
But I do think a part of that is both there's a demand for it, and you have all of these creators, all of these writers, all people across the board kind of creating content that speaks to it. And then that in tangent has also made it a very consumeristic uh industry, where you have to be careful, right? Like, a bath is amazing, but it isn't going to cure depression, right? Like, having a wonderful self-care routine on Sunday is so great and so necessary, but it's not going to make your anxiety go away on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Like, you have to have certain things that are more long-term, more quote unquote traditional, that can help you cope through things. But I do think there's an awareness campaign happening on digital that just makes it a lot more permissible to talk about it, right? It's almost like this domino effect. If you see me talking about it, you see someone else talking about it, and it keeps going. And that in and of itself is a form of self-care, and it's a form of community care, because the more that we talk about it as a community, the more that the individual is able to find exactly what they need in order to feel better.
That's a really interesting point, and one that I want to kind of push into a little bit
Mhm.
of. I feel like there's a lot of pushback, especially recently, of this idea that social media is just bad. Like that
Mhm.
seems to be the conversation. Social media is bad. It's the reason for all of the problems that we have and why mental health is actually declining. And it's, a lot of blame is put onto it. And however, you almost said the exact opposite, which I do agree with, by the way. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I feel like it's a very one-sided conversation right now.
Yeah, and I think there are truths to both sides, right? I tend to err on the side of it having been an amazing place for me,
Mhm.
right? And I check my privilege at the door, knowing that like I'm in a lot of ways lucky, because it is a really horrible place for other people. But at the same time, I'm Latina, I'm a woman. Talking about mental health and grief was just like not okay in other environments.
Yes.
So as a group that never had a place to talk about these things, the power of literally just starting an account and doing it in an environment like that was like, it's still mind blowing to me, because it is one of the only spaces for years that you would see more of a democratized environment for people of color, for people of different abilities, to talk about things that they would in other environments be shunned for. And that's something that I don't take for granted, because yes, there's like a bunch of bad that the technology can do, right? And I think that each platform is trying in their own way to like rectify some of the stuff that comes from that. But I think that when you talk about these micro communities and these individuals who maybe hadn't felt seen at all and now feel a lot like feel seen in ways that they hadn't,
Mhm.
like that's magic, right? And like that's something that they maybe wouldn't have been afforded in other situations. So it's almost like this good comes with the bad. I think on the side of how impactful it can be to mental health on the bad side of things, you know, I do see that as well, right? I think that we can get caught in the trap of comparison. We can go down spiral and all these things. So I think that there have to be boundaries there. But this is exactly what I said earlier too. Like I loved the community that I found on the internet for all the things that I was living through that felt very unique and isolating to me, because it gave me a community for them. But at the same time, I've been in therapy for the last 9 years, right? Like I've been doing other things that work for my mental health so that I don't slip. And if I do slip, I have something to catch me that isn't just the internet. So I think that when we talk about these bigger conversations, it does have to happen where like there's somewhere like exactly what we were talking about before, like balance. It doesn't mean 50-50 that it's only good or only bad. It just is like, what's the right cocktail of life and good balance here that can make the internet a good place for me without it being too much of a bad place.
For sure. And, I love that point of,
Mm-hmm.
just having more full conversations about it. I think we're so quick to want to just label things and pick
Mm-hmm.
sides of it's good or bad. I'm for it or against it, whatever it might be, and turning
Mm-hmm.
into a lot of that culture of let's not actually have a conversation about it. No, like I need to know if you're with me or against me. And
Mm-hmm.
there has to be a right answer, and not accepting the fact that, sometimes it's just gray.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's both.
And like for who is it good for and for who is it bad for,
Yes.
right? Like I think that that's a really big thing, is like conversations obviously over the last few years for a lot of different reasons have turned to diversity. And the reality is like someone like me, someone like a lot of people I know, creators of color, you just wouldn't have had the opportunities in the traditional market. Like you just, I mean, I'm talking about grief and mental health, and I'm getting brand deals on like the content creating side. And like that just wasn't true like years ago. And so when I think about it that way, I'm like, what this has done to make it okay to talk about really hard things is really, really cool, because it's also made it where, those teenagers who are struggling have someone to look up to who's, I openly talk about having anxiety and depression, and it just makes it feel a lot less scary.
Yeah, you know, and I think that was one of the biggest things when I started my journey and really what unlocked. And I started mine with therapy as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was about a year, at least a year, maybe 2 years before I even talked to anybody about it.
Mm-hmm.
And but the next big step and one of the most freeing steps was realizing I wasn't alone in this,
Mm-hmm.
because for me, that was the shame spiral that I fell into of I'm the only one that struggles with this. So I was struggling with it. Then I felt like I was the only one, which made me struggle with it more. And it just fed into itself and just got worse and
Mm-hmm.
worse and worse. And how freeing it was just hearing somebody else, um, just talk about their struggles. And whether it was the exact same one as mine or completely different, just knowing that other people, it's not perfect. It's not, this idealized version that I think a lot of us put out. And for me, that's on social media and not on social media too. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's in person of, again, not really wanting to know past that surface level, right?
Yeah.
Of, I don't want to know how you're actually doing. I want you to tell me that you're good so that we don't have to go into it. So I'm not put into that uncomfortable situation.
And I think it's, anyone wants that. Like no one wants to feel alone in the darkest places. And I also like one of the things that one of my friends told me, probably in one of the worst periods of depression, was years ago. She said, like, I may not know how to turn on the lights, but I can sit with you in the dark. And that is exactly what I think I try to create on the internet. Like, I don't have solutions for your problems. I have experiences that I've lived through for mine, and I'll share that with you. And like, that may or may not unlock or turn on some light for you too in your own way. But I'm not trying to say, like, I know exactly what you have to go through or what you're going through. But if somehow I am okay with sharing my experience and that then somehow makes it better for you, like that's all I can ask of that, right? And it's all I ask of anyone else for the seasons where I'm having a really hard time. Is like, I know I'm the only one who can navigate those things for myself, but I don't have to do it alone.
Yeah.
And that the way that the internet came through for me, right, during like one of my hardest seasons, where like my family and I love them, but they're not open about these things.
Yeah.
So at that time, if I put myself back to being 21, losing my grandmother, looking around at my family, all of them coping with their grief in really different ways, the only thing I had to hold on to that made me feel less weird was the internet. And so for that, I'm like, well, I will forever be thankful.
Yeah. And I think it opens up that community too
Mm-hmm.
of you're not constrained to your family, you're not constrained to the people that you went to school with or that
Mm-hmm.
or that live in your city. It opens it up to everything. And when you were talking about you might not have the exact answer, you might not have gone through the exact same thing, but you can share your experiences and hopefully it helps other people. I think that a lot of people fall into that trap as well, that like, oh, I can't talk about this
Mm-hmm.
because I can't save someone or I can't fix them,
Mm-hmm.
or I so because I can't do that, or because I can't help a million people, I'm not going to do it at all. And taking it very small and just sharing some
Mm-hmm.
of your experiences, just being open with it, every drop in the bucket counts. And it's helping one person with something that is extremely difficult is so satisfying that it's an experience that you know I cherish forever. And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to be those million people, it can be one, and it's just the same.
Oh my gosh, I've had the privilege, I think, of being able to have interactions with people where they'll come up to me and be like, oh my gosh, like this really impacted me. And I can promise you that I care a lot more about those interactions than like a million people liking something on Instagram, because those are amazing too for whatever that is. But there's just something where when you have the opportunity to really feel like you're connected with a person, it's humanizing, right? Like it takes things like depression or grief or anxiety and it turns it into a face,
Yeah.
and it turns it into a face that speaks back to you, right? And I think that that's something that we can do for ourselves, right? Like on really hard days where I'm the only person I'm speaking to, I have the opportunity to also be like, anxiety looks like you today, and I'm sorry, like you're not looking great, but I got you. And
Yeah.
like that is as powerful. Like you can still be that one person that you touch that day. And I think that we forget that often, right? Because we're so, it goes back to that same conversation of we're trying to serve other people. the entire time and get validation from that. But like, what does it look like to just validate myself and that I also have the power to help myself through things?
I love that so much. I think that's absolutely amazing. And I feel like we're just getting started here, but we are running out of time. I'm curious if there's anything before we jump off here that we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about or say.
I just hope that anyone who's listening, whether you're in the dark place right now or you're like treading through the light, that you just feel very seen and supported, and that you remember that at the end of the day, you are so loved and you have the opportunity to love yourself, even if it's in ways that you think are quite small, they're still quite meaningful. I'm just glad that I was able to join you in this conversation.
I am so thankful for you being here, and thank you so much for sharing and being vulnerable and all of your wisdom. Now, if people want to follow you, get to know you, learn more, where would be the best places for them to do that?
Yeah, of course. So you can follow me at Viv Nunez on Instagram. I've started up a TikTok, so I'm on there too. And then vivnunez.com is my website.
Amazing. We'll put those in the show notes for everybody so they can find it.
Thank you
Once
so
again, just
much.
yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, I can't wait to see what you do in the future.